The wind howled through the skeletal trees, rattling the iron gates of Blackgate Asylum, as if the night itself were trying to claw its way inside. Rain lashed the crumbling stone walls, each drop echoing through the empty corridors, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something unspeakable. On this night, October 12, 1927, the world outside was oblivious to the terror that was about to unfold within these walls. But for those inside, the air was thick with a sense of impending doom, a heaviness that pressed down on every breath, every heartbeat. Imagine it, 60 souls, each one marked by the world as broken, lost, or dangerous, gathered together in the flickering candlelight of the great hall. The staff moved among them, faces drawn and wary, their eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every flash of lightning. Somewhere, a clock chimed midnight, its sound swallowed by the storm. The Feast of Remembrance had begun, a rare event, whispered about in the town below, shrouded in both hope and dread. But as the night deepened, something shifted. Doors that should have been locked stood ajar. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. The power flickered, plunging the asylum into moments of utter darkness, where the only sound was the frantic beating of hearts and the distant, mournful wail of the wind. And then, as if swallowed by the night itself, 60 patients vanished, gone, without a trace, leaving behind only overturned chairs, cold plates, and a silence so profound it seemed to seep into the very stones. Would you dare to enter Blackgate, knowing what happened here? Would you walk those halls, feel the chill that lingers in the air, and listen for the whispers of the vanished? Tonight, we will peel back the layers of myth and memory, exposing secrets that have festered in the dark for nearly a century. What really happened on that storm-lashed night? Was it a mass escape, a sinister conspiracy, or something far more disturbing? Before we begin, I want to hear your theories. What do you believe happened to the lost souls of Blackgate? Share your thoughts below, and prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of darkness. The truth, I promise you, is far stranger than fiction. Blackgate Asylum stands alone on the edge of the world, perched atop a windswept bluff where the land surrenders to the churning sea. The road that leads to its gates is little more than a scar through the moorland, winding past gnarled trees and fields of wild heather that seem to wither in its shadow. Even in daylight, the asylum looms like a bruise against the horizon, its towers and turrets clawing at the sky, its windows staring blankly out over the restless waters below. At night, it becomes something else entirely, a silhouette of stone and sorrow, shrouded in mist and memory. When Blackgate first opened its doors in 1883, it was hailed as a beacon of hope, a sanctuary for the afflicted, a place where the broken could be mended and the lost could find their way home. The founder, Dr. Ambrose Fenwick, was a man of vision and compassion, determined to bring light to the darkness of mental illness. He filled the halls with sunlight and music, encouraged patients to paint and garden, and insisted that every soul who entered Blackgate be treated with dignity. For a time, it seemed as if the asylum might truly live up to its promise. But hope is a fragile thing, easily crushed beneath the weight of reality. As the years passed, the world outside changed, and so did Blackgate. Funding dried up, staff grew weary, and the once bright halls began to darken. The gardens withered, the music faded, and the walls once painted in cheerful colors became stained with damp and neglect. Dr. Fenwick died under mysterious circumstances, and his successors lacked both his vision and his heart. The asylum's reputation soured, whispered about in the town below as a place of cruelty and despair. Stories began to circulate, stories of patients locked away for decades, of treatments that bordered on torture, of screams echoing through the night. Some said the building itself was cursed, that the land it stood on was tainted by something older and darker than any human suffering. Others spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows, of shadows moving where no one should be, of a coldness that seeped into the bones and never quite left. The townsfolk learned to avert their eyes when passing Blackgate, to cross themselves and quicken their steps, as if afraid the darkness might reach out and claim them too. Yet, for all its decay, Blackgate retained a certain grim majesty. The main building, with its arched stone entrance and sweeping staircases, still bore the marks of its grand beginnings. The chapel, though long abandoned, stood as a silent witness to prayers, both answered and ignored. The patient wards, once filled with laughter and light, now echoed with the hollow sound of emptiness. Even the gardens, choked with weeds and brambles, hinted at the beauty they once held. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the residue of suffering and secrets. The air smelled of old paper, antiseptic, and something metallic, blood perhaps, or rust. The walls were lined with faded photographs of patients and staff, their faces blurred by time and neglect. In the common rooms, battered furniture set in uneasy silence, as if waiting for someone to return. The staff moved through the corridors like ghosts, their footsteps muffled by threadbare carpets, their eyes haunted by things they could not name. It was in this place, caught between the promise of healing and the reality of despair, that the events of that fateful night would unfold. Blackgate was more than just a building. It was a living thing, shaped by the hopes and horrors of those who passed through its doors. Its stones had absorbed a century of pain, and its shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The line between sanity and madness, between care and cruelty, had long since blurred. As the storm gathered on the night of the feast, the asylum seemed to hold its breath. The wind rattled the windows, the sea crashed against the cliffs, and somewhere deep within the walls, something ancient stirred. The darkness that had always lingered at the edges of Blackgate was about to step into the light, and those who called it home, staff and patient alike, would soon discover that some places are not meant to be healed, and some secrets are better left buried. This is the world of Blackgate, a monument to hope corrupted, a sanctuary turned prison, a place where the shadows are never quite empty. As we move deeper into its story, remember this contrasted dream of healing and the reality of ruin, for in the heart of Blackgate, the line between the two is as thin as a whisper, and just as easily lost. Every story of darkness is shaped by those who walk its corridors, and Blackgate's tale is no exception. The night 60 patients vanished. 4 figures stood at the heart of the storm, each carrying secrets, each casting shadows of their own. At the center was Dr. Elias Harrow, the asylum's head physician, tall and gaunt, with a face carved by sleepless nights and a gaze that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. Dr. Harrow was a man both respected and feared. He had arrived at Blackgate 5 years prior, inheriting a legacy of decline and a staff on the brink of collapse. Some whispered that he was a genius, a pioneer in the treatment of the mind. Others claimed he was a cold, calculating man, more interested in the boundaries of science than the souls in his care. Harrow's office was lined with medical texts and occult volumes alike, and he was known to walk the halls at all hours, murmuring to himself in Latin or jotting cryptic notes in a battered leather journal. His methods were unconventional, brilliant, sometimes brutal. He believed that the mind could be broken and rebuilt, that madness was a puzzle to be solved, no matter the cost. Yet, beneath his clinical detachment, there were moments fleeting, almost imperceptible, when a flicker of sorrow crossed his features, as if he, too, was haunted by the ghosts of Blackgate. In stark contrast stood Nurse Lillian Graves, the heart of the asylum. Where Harrow was distant, Lillian was present, her touch gentle, her voice a balm in a place of suffering. She had grown up in the nearby village, the daughter of a fisherman, lost at sea, and had joined Blackgate as a young woman, determined to bring comfort where she could. Lillian knew every patient by name, remembered their birthdays, and smuggled wildflowers into the wards when she could. She was beloved by the patients, trusted by the staff, and quietly resented by those who saw her compassion as weakness. Yet Lillian was no stranger to darkness. She had seen what the world could do to the vulnerable, and she carried her own scars, hidden beneath her starched uniform, revealed only in the rare moments when she allowed herself to weep. On the night of the feast, it was Lillian who moved among the tables, offering smiles and whispered reassurances, even as unease gnawed at her heart. Then there was patient 47, a cipher wrapped in mystery. He had arrived at Blackgate only weeks before the vanishing, delivered in the dead of night, by men who refused to give their names. His records were incomplete, his history a patchwork of contradictions. Some said he was a war veteran, shattered by horrors no one could imagine. Others believed he was a criminal, sent to Blackgate to disappear. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were precise, almost scholarly, laced with references to ancient texts and forgotten rituals. The other patients avoided him, sensing something uncanny in his presence. Even Dr. Harrow seemed unsettled by him, often watching from a distance, as if waiting for patient 47 to reveal his true purpose. On the night of the feast, patient 47 sat alone at the end of the table, eyes fixed on the storm outside, lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps incantation. Finally, there was Thomas Reed, the outsider. Reed was a journalist from the local paper, drawn to Blackgate by rumors of mistreatment and unexplained deaths. He was young, sharp-witted, and unafraid to ask uncomfortable questions. Reed had spent weeks interviewing staff and patients, scribbling notes in his battered notebook, piecing together a story that he hoped would expose the truth behind Blackgate's walls. He distrusted authority, especially men like Dr. Harrow, and was quick to spot inconsistencies in the official narrative. Yet Reed was not immune to the asylum's atmosphere. The longer he stayed, the more he found himself plagued by nights of faceless figures and endless corridors, of screams muffled by stone. On the night of the vanishing, Reed was present as an observer, his pen poised to capture whatever horrors might unfold. Each of these four carried their own burdens, their own secrets. Dr. Harrow, with his obsession for control and his fear of failure. Nurse Lillian, with her quiet defiance and her desperate hope that kindness could survive in a place like Blackgate. Patient 47, whose very presence seemed to warp the air around him, hinting at knowledge both forbidden and dangerous. And Thomas Reed, whose skepticism masked a deeper vulnerability, longing to believe that truth could triumph over darkness. But in Blackgate, nothing was ever as it seemed. Motives twisted in the shadows, alliances shifted with the wind, and every act of kindness or cruelty left ripples that would be felt long after the feast had ended. As the storm gathered and the night pressed in, these four would find themselves bound together by fate, each playing a part in the mystery that would consume the asylum. Who among them was to be trusted? Who harbored guilt, or fear, or something far more sinister? As you listen to their stories, ask yourself, what would you have done, trapped within those walls? With the storm raging outside and the darkness closing in, would you have clung to hope or surrendered to despair? Would you have become a savior or a monster? In the end, the answers may be as elusive as the vanished themselves. But to understand what happened at Blackgate, we must first understand those who called it home, then those who, for one terrible night, became its witnesses. The announcement came on a gray morning, when the sea mist clung to the windows and the world outside seemed to dissolve into a pale, uncertain haze. Dr. Harrow stood at the head of the dining hall, his voice echoing off the high, arched ceiling, as he addressed the assembled patients and staff. This Friday, he declared, we will hold a feast of remembrance, a tradition nearly forgotten, but one I believe is worth reviving. His words were measured, almost ceremonial, and, for a moment, a ripple of excitement passed through the room. For the patients, the promise of a feast was a rare and precious thing. Meals at Blackgate were usually meager and monotonous: thin soup, stale bread, the occasional bruised apple. But the Feast of Remembrance was different. It was a night when the rules were relaxed, when the tables were set with real linens and the kitchen staff worked for days to prepare roast meats, fresh vegetables, and sweet puddings. For many, it was the only time in the year when they felt truly seen, when the boundaries between patient and person seemed to blur, if only for a few hours. Yet beneath the surface, unease simmered. The staff exchanged wary glances as Dr. Harrow spoke, their faces tight with worry. Nurse Lillian, usually a beacon of calm, found herself wringing her hands beneath the table. She remembered the last feast, years ago, when a patient had suffered a violent fit and the celebration had ended in chaos. Since then, the tradition had been quietly abandoned, till now. Lillian wondered what had prompted Harrow to resurrect it, and why he seemed so intent on making this year's feast a grand affair. Preparations began at once. The kitchen was filled with the sense of roasting meat and baking bread, a welcome change from the usual antiseptic temps. Patients were given new clothes, simple but clean, and the halls were decorated with garlands of dried flowers and faded banners from years past. Some of the older patients wept when they saw the decorations, overcome by memories of better times. Others grew restless, their anticipation tinged with anxiety. The feast was a break from routine, and in Blackgate, routine was often the only thing that kept fear at bay. Patient 47 watched the preparations with a detached curiosity. He spent hours in the library, poring over old records and muttering to himself in a language no one else understood. When asked if he was looking forward to the feast, he simply smiled, a thin, enigmatic curve of the lips that left the staff unsettled. "It is a night for remembering," he said once, his voice barely above a whisper. "But some memories are best left undisturbed." Thomas Reed, ever the observer, sensed the tension in the air. He noticed how the staff avoided certain rooms, how they spoke in hushed tones when Dr. Harrow was near. Reed made a point of interviewing the kitchen staff, the orderlies, even the groundskeeper, searching for any hint of what might be brewing. Beneath the surface, he found little but rumor stories of strange noises in the night, of patients waking with scratches on their arms, of a coldness that seemed to seep from the very walls. Reed jotted it all down, his curiosity sharpening into suspicion. As the day of the feast approached, the weather turned. Clouds gathered over the sea, heavy and bruised, and the wind began to howl through the cracks in the old stone. The patients grew restless, their moods swinging between giddy excitement and sudden, inexplicable terror. Some spoke of dreams, unsettling visions of long corridors and locked doors, of voices calling from the darkness. Nurse Lillian did her best to comfort them, but she, too, felt the weight of something approaching, something she could not name. On the morning of the feast, Dr. Harrow made his rounds with an intensity that bordered on manic. He checked and rechecked the seating arrangements, inspected the kitchen, and questioned the staff about every detail. "Tonight must be perfect," he insisted, his eyes burning with a strange fervor. "We owe it to them, to all of them." No one dared to ask who he meant. As dusk fell, the asylum was transformed. Candles flickered in every window, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The great hall was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and nervous laughter, the air thick with the mingled sense of food and fear. The patients filed in, some smiling, some trembling, all of them drawn by the promise of something extraordinary. But even as hope flickered in their eyes, dread lingered at the edges. The storm outside had grown fiercer, the wind shrieking like a living thing. The staff moved among the tables, their smiles brittle, their eyes darting to the doors and windows, as if expecting something or someone to appear. Patient 47 sat at the end of the table, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the glass, lips moving in silent prayer. The feast of remembrance had begun. But beneath the laughter and the music, beneath the clatter of plates and the glow of candlelight, something ancient and hungry stirred. The line between celebration and ritual, between hope and horror, was about to be crossed, and in the heart of Blackgate, the shadows waited, patient and unblinking, for the night to reveal its true face. 7 p.m. The Feast of Remembrance began with a toast. Dr. Harrow stood at the head of the table, his glass raised high, his voice echoing through the candlelit hall. "To memory," he intoned, "and to the hope that we may find peace, even in the darkest of places." The patients and staff echoed his words, some with genuine feeling, others with the hollow resignation of ritual. Outside, the storm battered the windows, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Lightning flashed, illuminating the faces around, the table faces marked by hope, fear, and something else, something unspoken. 7:30 p.m. The first course was served. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, luxuries, in a place accustomed to scarcity. For a brief moment, laughter and conversation filled the hall. Nurse Lillian moved among the tables, her presence a balm to the anxious. She noticed patient 47 barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on the storm outside. Thomas Reed scribbled notes, his gaze flickering from Dr. Harrow to the staff, searching for cracks in the facade. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone sensed that this night was different. 8 p.m. The lights flickered. At first, it was barely noticeably brief dimming, a shiver of shadow across the walls. But then the candles guttered, and the electric bulbs buzzed and sputtered. The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling over the asylum in waves. Some patients whimpered, clutching their napkins like talismans. Dr. Harrow assured everyone it was nothing, just the weather, but his voice was strained. Nurse Lillian caught his eye, and for a moment, something passed between them, fear, or perhaps a warning. 8:30 p.m., the whispers began. At first, they seemed like the wind, snaking through the cracks in the stone. But soon, the staff realized the voices were coming from within the hall itself, soft, urgent, unintelligible. Some patients began to murmur in response, their words slurred and strange. Patient 47's lips moved in silent rhythm, his eyes closed as if in trance. Reed leaned forward, straining to catch the words, but they slipped away like smoke. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, their nerves fraying with each passing minute. 9 p.m. A sudden crash of thunder plunged the hall into darkness. The power failed completely, leaving only the flicker of candles to hold back the night. In the confusion, a patient screamed a high, keening sound that seemed to echo from every corner. Nurse Lillian rushed to comfort her, but the woman's eyes were wide with terror, her hands clawing at her own face. "They're here," she whispered, over and over. "They're here." Dr. Harrow ordered the staff to remain calm, but his own hands trembled as he relit the candles. 9:30 p.m. The storm raged on, the wind rattling the windows with increasing violence. The temperature in the hall dropped, breath misting in the air. Some patients began to shiver uncontrollably, their teeth chattering. Others grew agitated, pacing the room or muttering to themselves. Patient 47 stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He stared at Dr. Harrow, his voice low and urgent. "You should not have called them," he said. "You do not know what you have invited." The words sent a chill through the room, and for a moment, even the storm seemed to pause. 10 p.m. The staff attempted to restore order, ushering the most distressed patients back to their rooms. But the corridors were darker than usual, the shadows deeper, the air thick with the scent of ozone and fear. Reed followed Nurse Lillian as she led a group of patients down the hall, his notebook forgotten in his pocket. He heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, the corridor was empty. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakably voices calling, pleading, accusing. The walls seemed to pulse with each word, as if the building itself were alive. 10:30 p.m. In the kitchen, a pot boiled over, sending a plume of steam into the air. The cook swore, wiping her brow, but when she looked up, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a patient, or so she thought, until the figure melted into the shadows. In the chapel, a candle guttered out, plunging the room into darkness. Someone no one could say who began to sing, a low, mournful hymn that echoed through the empty pews. The staff grew frantic, searching for missing patients. But the halls seemed to twist and lengthen. Doors lead into places they shouldn't. 11 p.m. The great hall was nearly empty now, the feast abandoned. Plates of untouched food sat cooling on the tables, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Dr. Harrow paced the room, his face pale and drawn. Nurse Lillian found him there, her own nerves frayed to the breaking point. "We need to get them out," she whispered. "Something is wrong. We need to." But before she could finish, the lights flickered back to life for a brief, blinding moment. In that instant, every shadow seemed to leap and writhe, forming shapes that defied explanation. 11:30 p.m. The power failed again, plunging the asylum into a darkness so complete it felt suffocating. The storm reached its peak, the wind shrieking, the rain lashing the windows like claws. Somewhere, a door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Reed, separated from the others, found himself lost in a maze of corridors. The whispers now a cacophony in his ears. He stumbled upon patient 47, who stood before a locked door, his hands pressed to the wood, chanting in a language Reed could not understand. Midnight, the hour of the feast's true purpose. In the heart of Blackgate, something shifted, a presence, ancient and hungry, stirring in the darkness. The patients vanished, one by one, their absence marked only by overturned chairs and the lingering echo of their voices. The staff searched, in vain, their cries swallowed by the storm. And as the clock struck 12, a silence fell over the asylum, a silence so deep, so absolute, it seemed to erase everything that had come before. Something was terribly wrong, and the night was far from over. 7 p.m. The Feast of Remembrance began with a toast. Dr. Harrow stood at the head of the table, his glass raised high, his voice echoing through the candlelit hall. To memory, he intoned, and to the hope that we may find peace, even in the darkest of places. The patients and staff echoed his words, some with genuine feeling, others with the hollow resignation of ritual. Outside, the storm battered the windows, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Lightning flashed, illuminating the faces around, the table faces marked by hope, fear, and something else, something unspoken. 7:30 p.m. The first course was served. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, luxuries, in a place accustomed to scarcity. For a brief moment, laughter and conversation filled the hall. Nurse Lillian moved among the tables, her presence a balm to the anxious. She noticed patient 47 barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on the storm outside. Thomas Reed scribbled notes, his gaze flickering from Dr. Harrow to the staff, searching for cracks in the facade. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone sensed that this night was different. 8 p.m. The lights flickered. At first, it was barely noticeably brief dimming, a shiver of shadow across the walls. But then the candles guttered, and the electric bulbs buzzed and sputtered. The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling over the asylum in waves. Some patients whimpered, clutching their napkins like talismans. Dr. Harrow assured everyone it was nothing, just the weather, but his voice was strained. Nurse Lillian caught his eye, and for a moment, something passed between them, fear, or perhaps a warning. 8:30 p.m. The whispers began. At first, they seemed like the wind, snaking through the cracks in the stone. But soon, the staff realized the voices were coming from within the hall itself, soft, urgent, unintelligible. Some patients began to murmur in response, their words slurred and strange. Patient 47's lips moved in silent rhythm, his eyes closed as if in trance. Reed leaned forward, straining to catch the words, but they slipped away like smoke. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, their nerves fraying with each passing minute. 9 p.m. A sudden crash of thunder plunged the hall into darkness. The power failed completely, leaving only the flicker of candles to hold back the night. In the confusion, a patient screamed a high, keening sound that seemed to echo from every corner. Nurse Lillian rushed to comfort her, but the woman's eyes were wide with terror, her hands clawing at her own face. "They're here," she whispered, over and over. "They're here." Dr. Harrow ordered the staff to remain calm, but his own hands trembled as he relit the candles. 9:30 p.m. The storm raged on, the wind rattling the windows with increasing violence. The temperature in the hall dropped, breath misting in the air. Some patients began to shiver uncontrollably, their teeth chattering. Others grew agitated, pacing the room or muttering to themselves. Patient 47 stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He stared at Dr. Harrow, his voice low and urgent. "You should not have called them," he said. "You do not know what you have invited." The words sent a chill through the room, and for a moment, even the storm seemed to pause. 10 p.m. The staff attempted to restore order, ushering the most distressed patients back to their rooms. But the corridors were darker than usual, the shadows deeper, the air thick with the scent of ozone and fear. Reed followed Nurse Lillian as she led a group of patients down the hall, his notebook forgotten in his pocket. He heard footsteps behind him, but when he turned, the corridor was empty. The whispers grew louder, now unmistakably voices calling, pleading, accusing. The walls seemed to pulse with each word, as if the building itself were alive. 10:30 p.m. In the kitchen, a pot boiled over, sending a plume of steam into the air. The cook swore, wiping her brow, but when she looked up, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a patient, or so she thought, until the figure melted into the shadows. In the chapel, a candle guttered out, plunging the room into darkness. Someone no one could say who began to sing, a low, mournful hymn that echoed through the empty pews. The staff grew frantic, searching for missing patients. But the halls seemed to twist and lengthen. Doors lead into places they shouldn't. 11 p.m. The great hall was nearly empty now, the feast abandoned. Plates of untouched food sat cooling on the tables, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Dr. Harrow paced the room, his face pale and drawn. Nurse Lillian found him there, her own nerves frayed to the breaking point. "We need to get them out," she whispered. "Something is wrong. We need to." But before she could finish, the lights flickered back to life for a brief, blinding moment. In that instant, every shadow seemed to leap and writhe, forming shapes that defied explanation. 11:30 p.m. The power failed again, plunging the asylum into a darkness so complete it felt suffocating. The storm reached its peak, the wind shrieking, the rain lashing the windows like claws. Somewhere, a door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Reed, separated from the others, found himself lost in a maze of corridors, the whispers now a cacophony in his ears. He stumbled upon patient 47, who stood before a locked door, his hands pressed to the wood, chanting in a language Reed could not understand. Midnight, the hour of the feast's true purpose. In the heart of Blackgate, something shifted, a presence, ancient and hungry, stirring in the darkness. The patients vanished, one by one, their absence marked only by overturned chairs and the lingering echo of their voices. The staff searched, in vain, their cries swallowed by the storm. And as the clock struck 12, a silence fell over the asylum, a silence so deep, so absolute, it seemed to erase everything that had come before. Something was terribly wrong, and the night was far from over. To 13 a.m., the hour would be burned into memory, though for many it would feel more like a fever dream than a moment in time. The storm had not relented. If anything, it had grown more violent, the wind shrieking through the eaves, the rain hammering the roof with relentless fury. Inside Blackgate, the world had shrunk to a series of flickering candlelit islands, each one surrounded by a sea of darkness and dread. It was Nurse Lillian who first noticed the silence. She had been making her rounds, checking on the patients who had been sent back to their rooms after the chaos in the great hall. The corridors, usually alive with restless movement and muffled voices, were eerily still. She paused outside Ward C, her lantern casting a trembling circle of light on the door. She knocked softly, then opened it tonely, to find the beds empty, the sheets undisturbed, as if the patients had simply evaporated into the night. Panic prickled at the edges of her mind. She hurried to the next ward, and the next, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. Each room told the same story. Beds neatly made, personal belongings untouched, not a single patient in sight. The only evidence of their presence was a faint, lingering warmth in the air, as if they had only just left. Lillian's heart hammered in her chest. She called out for help, her voice swallowed by the storm. Elsewhere, Dr. Harrow was in his office, poring over his journal by the light of a single candle. He heard Lillian's cries and rushed into the corridor, his face drawn and pale. The two met in the main hall, where a handful of staff had already gathered, their faces etched with confusion and fear. "They're gone," Lillian whispered, her voice barely audible. "All of them, every single one." The staff fanned out, searching every corner of the asylum. They checked the kitchens, the chapel, the gardens, even the locked storage rooms. Doors that should have been bolted were found ajar, Windows that had been sealed for years now stood open to the storm. In the great hall, the remnants of the feast sat untouched, the food cold and congealed, the candles burned down to stubs. The only sign of life was the wind, which seemed to carry with it the faintest echo of laughter, or was it weeping? Thomas Reed, who had spent the last hour lost in the labyrinthine corridors, stumbled upon the search party. He listened in disbelief as the staff recounted what they had found, or rather, what they hadn't. Reed's instincts as a journalist warred with his growing sense of terror. He began to document everything: the empty beds, the open windows, the strange symbols scrawled in chalk on the walls. He questioned the staff, pressed them for details, but no one had seen or heard anything. It was as if the patients had been spirited away in the blink of an eye. Outside, the storm had drawn the attention of the townsfolk. A few brave souls, worried by the flickering lights and the distant sound of sirens, made their way up the hill to Blackgate. They arrived to find the gates swinging open, the grounds eerily deserted. The villagers huddled together, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness as they approached the main entrance. Inside, they found chaos. Staff running from room to room, voices raised in panic, the air thick with fear and confusion. One of the townsfolk, an old fisherman named Callum, would later recall the moment he realized something was terribly wrong. "It was the silence," he said. "You expect a place like that to be noisy, even in the middle of the night. But it was quiet, too quiet, like the whole building was holding its breath." As the search continued, the sense of unreality deepened. Some staff insisted they had seen patients only moments before, sitting quietly in their rooms or wandering the halls. Others claimed to have heard voices, footsteps, even laughter, but when they turned to look, there was no one there. Nurse Lillian found herself questioning her own memory. Had she really seen patient 47 in the library? Or had it been a trick of the light? Dr. Harrow grew increasingly agitated, barking orders, demanding answers that no one could give. In the chapel, Reed found a single survivor, a young woman named Elsie, who sat huddled beneath the altar, her eyes wide with terror. She clutched a scrap of fabric in her hands, rocking back and forth as she whispered a single phrase over and over. "They called us. They called us, and we answered." Reed tried to question her, but she would say nothing more. By dawn, the truth was undeniable. 60 patients had vanished without a trace. No footprints in the mud, no bodies in the sea, no sign of struggle or escape. The authorities would later search the grounds, drag the cliffs, and question every member of staff, but they would find nothing. The official report would list the event as a mass escape, but those who were there knew better. Something had happened. In the heart of Blackgate, that night, something that defied explanation. And now, I ask you, if you were there, in those endless, echoing halls, with the storm raging outside and the world unraveling around you, what would you have done? Would you have searched for the missing, or fled into the night? Would you have trusted your senses, or doubted your own mind? Share your thoughts below, and remember, sometimes, the most terrifying mysteries are the ones that leave no trace at all. The days that followed the vanishing at Blackgate were a fever dream of confusion, accusation, and dread. The storm had finally passed, leaving the asylum battered and the surrounding moorland sodden and scarred. The authorities arrived at dawn, summoned by frantic telegrams and the wild-eyed accounts of staff and townsfolk. What they found was a place hollowed out by fear, a building that seemed to echo with the absence of those who had vanished. The official investigation began with a flurry of activity. Police officers in heavy coats trudged through the mud, searching the grounds for any sign of the missing. They questioned everyone's staff, the few remaining patients, even the villagers who had come to help. Dr. Harrow, pale and exhausted, led them through the wards, his voice clipped and brittle. He insisted on rational explanations, a coordinated escape, perhaps aided by someone on the inside, a mass delusion, triggered by the storm and the heightened emotions of the feast. There must be a logical answer, he repeated, as if saying, it enough times would make it true. But the evidence refused to cooperate. There were no footprints leading away from the asylum, no broken locks or forced windows. The gates had been found open, but the mud outside was undisturbed, save for the tracks of the search parties. The patients' belongings remained untouched: clothes, neatly folded, letters, and photographs left behind as if their owners had simply stepped out for a moment. In the great hall, the remnants of the feast sat untouched, the food now rotting, the air thick with the sickly sweet scent of decay. The staff were questioned one by one, their statements recorded in neat, official script. Nurse Lillian described her rounds, her growing sense of unease, the moment she realized the wards were empty. Her voice trembled as she recounted the silence, the way the air seemed to press in around her. It was as if they'd been erased, she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears, as if they'd never been there at all. Other staff members offered conflicting accounts. Some claimed to have seen patients wandering the halls after midnight, their faces blank, their movements strange and jerky. One orderly insisted he had heard singing coming from the chapel, though when he went to investigate, he found it empty. Another swore she had seen patient 47 standing at the end of a corridor, his eyes glowing in the candlelight, but when she blinked, he was gone. The testimonies grew wilder as the days passed, stories of shadows moving against the walls, of voices whispering in languages no one could understand, of doors that led to rooms that shouldn't exist. The police, for their part, tried to impose order on the chaos. They cataloged every scrap of evidence, every rumor and half-remembered detail. They found strange symbols scrawled in chalk on the walls of several ward circles within circles, intersected by jagged lines. In the chapel, they discovered a book of hymns with several pages torn out. The missing leaves, later found in patient 47's room, covered in dense, frantic writings. The words made little sense: fragments of Latin, references to ancient rituals, pleas for forgiveness, and warnings of something awakening beneath the stones. The townsfolk, meanwhile, had their own theories. Some believed the patients had escaped through a secret tunnel, a relic of the asylum's construction. Others whispered of a cult operating within Blackgate, using the feast as cover for a ritual gone horribly wrong. The more superstitious spoke of possession, of evil spirits drawn to the suffering within the asylum's walls. That place was cursed from the start, muttered old Callum, the fisherman who had found the gates open. You could feel it in your bones. Thomas Reed, ever the skeptic, tried to make sense of it all. He pored over his notes, cross-referencing testimonies, searching for patterns. He interviewed the staff again and again, pressing them for details, but the stories only grew more contradictory. Reed found himself drawn to patient 47's room, where the torn hymn pages and cryptic writings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. He copied the symbols into his notebook, determined to find their meaning. At night, he dreamed of endless corridors and locked doors, of voices calling his name from the darkness. The inquiry dragged on for weeks. The police brought in expert psychologists, priests, even a pair of self-styled occult investigators from London. The psychologists spoke of mass hysteria, of the power of suggestion and the fragility of the human mind. In a place like this, one explained, fear can spread like wildfire. People see what they expect to see. The priests performed blessings in every room, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers, but the staff reported little change. The occultists, for their part, were fascinated by the symbols and the writings, claiming they matched descriptions of ancient rituals, meant to thin the veil between worlds. As the days turned to weeks, hope of finding the missing patients faded. The search parties grew smaller, the questions more desperate. Dr. Harrow withdrew into himself, spending long hours in his office, refusing visitors. Nurse Lillian tried to comfort the remaining patients, but her own faith was shaken. She found herself staring at the empty beds, wondering if she had missed some crucial sign, some warning that could have prevented the tragedy. One night, Reed found Lillian in the chapel, her hands clasped in prayer. He sat beside her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken fears. "Do you think they're still alive?" he asked quietly. Lillian shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I feel them. I feel their absence, like a wound that won't heal." The final report was a masterpiece of ambiguity. It listed the official cause as mass escape under unknown circumstances, but included pages of conflicting testimonies and unexplained phenomena. The authorities closed the case, the press moved on, and Blackgate was left to its silence. But those who had been their staff, townsfolk, survivors knew the truth was far stranger and far more terrifying than anything written in the official record. And what about you? Faced with such madness, would you cling to reason or surrender to the possibility of something beyond understanding? Would you trust the evidence or the whispers in the dark? In the end, the line between truth and madness at Blackgate was as thin as a shadow and just as easily crossed. In the weeks that followed, the vanishing Blackgate Asylum became a wound that would not close. The authorities, eager to restore order, shuttered the building and posted guards at its gates. But the damage had already seeped into the bones of the town. The story of the missing 60 spread like a contagion, infecting every conversation, every sleepless night. For those who had lived through it, the world was forever changed, haunted by the memory of that storm-lashed night and the silence that followed. Nurse Lillian was the first to leave. She packed her few belongings in a battered suitcase and walked away from Blackgate without looking back. But the asylum followed her, a shadow at her heels. She found work in a distant city, tending to the sick in a crowded hospital. But she never spoke of her years at Blackgate. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, she would wake with the taste of salt on her lips and the sound of distant thunder in her ears. She kept a letter from Dr. Fenwick hidden in a drawer, its words a constant ache in her chest. She wondered, often, if she could have done more, if she had missed some sign, some plea for help. The guilt gnawed at her, a silent companion she could never quite escape. Dr. Harrow's fate was more public and more tragic. The inquiry had left him a broken man, his reputation in ruins. He was dismissed from his post, shunned by his colleagues, and hounded by the press. He retreated into obscurity, living out his days in a small, rented room above a shop in the city. Those who saw him described a man hollowed out by loss, his eyes haunted by things he could not name. He died alone, his journals filled with frantic scribbles and half-finished thoughts. In the margins, he had written the same phrase over and over: "They are not gone. They are not gone." Thomas Reed published his account of the Blackgate vanishing, but the world was not ready to listen. His articles were dismissed as sensationalism, his reputation as a journalist forever tainted by his association with the case. He left the profession, turning instead to local history, collecting stories of other places where the past refused to stay buried. In his old age, he would sometimes visit the ruins of Blackgate, standing at the gates and listening to the wind. He claimed he could still hear the voices of the vanished, calling to him from the darkness. The town itself changed in subtle, insidious ways. The villagers avoided the road to Blackgate, letting the weeds and brambles reclaim the path. Children were warned to stay away, and the old stories grew darker with each retelling. Some said the land was cursed, that nothing would grow where the asylum's shadow fell. Others claimed to see lights flickering in the windows at night, or to hear music drifting on the wind. The silence around Blackgate became a kind of pact, a collective agreement to forget, to let the past sink into the earth. But not everyone could forget. The families of the missing clung to hope, searching for answers in every scrap of news, every rumor. Some left flowers at the gates, others scrawled desperate messages on the crumbling walls. The pain of not knowing became its own kind of madness, a wound that festered in the dark. The town learned to live with its ghosts, but the memory of the vanished never truly faded. And what of the asylum itself? Blackgate stood empty for years, its windows shattered by storms, its halls choked with dust and silence. Nature crept in, reclaiming the gardens and the courtyards, but the building resisted decay, as if unwilling to surrender its secrets. Occasionally, thrill-seekers and ghost hunters would slip through the gates, drawn by the promise of a mystery unsolved. Some returned with stories of cold spots and strange noises, of shadows that moved against the grain of the light. Others left in silence, their faces pale, their eyes wide with something they could not explain. If you have ever stood in a place where the past lingers, an abandoned house, a forgotten hospital, a stretch of woods where the air feels heavy with memory. You know the feeling, the sense that something is watching, waiting, just out of sight. The knowledge that some stories refuse to be buried, no matter how deep the earth or how thick the silence. Have you ever encountered a place like Blackgate, a place that seemed to remember more than it should, that pressed its history into your bones? Share your stories in the comments below. Tell us about the mysteries that haunt you, the questions that keep you awake at night. For in the end, we are all shaped by the shadows we carry, and by the echoes of those who vanished before us. Black Story is not just a tale of horror, but a reminder. Some wounds never heal, some silences are never broken, and some mysteries are meant to linger, echoing in the dark. What remains of Blackgate now is not just a ruin on a windswept hill, but a question that gnaws at the edges of memory. The vanished patients are more than a mystery. They are a mirror, reflecting the ways in which society has always struggled to face its own darkness. In the end, Blackgate is not only a story about what happened on a single storm-torn night, but about how we remember and how we choose to forget. Memory is a fragile thing. It can be twisted by fear, blurred by time, or deliberately erased when the truth becomes too heavy to bear. For the survivors of Blackgate, memory was both a curse and a lifeline, a way to honor the lost, but also a wound that refused to heal. Trauma lingers in the mind, reshaping the world long after the event itself has faded. How many of us carry scars from things we cannot name, shadows from stories we were never allowed to finish? And what of the vulnerable, the forgotten, the silenced, the ones society locks away when their suffering becomes inconvenient? Blackgate was built as a sanctuary, but it became a prison, a place where the line between care and cruelty was easily crossed. The vanished patients are a testament to what happens when we turn away from those who need us most, when we allow institutions to become machines for erasure rather than healing. So, what is worse, to know the truth, no matter how terrible, or to let it slip into oblivion? Is it kinder to remember, even when memory brings pain, or to forget and risk repeating the same mistakes? When a community chooses silence over justice, what does it lose in the process? And when we encounter the ruins of places like Blackgate, do we owe it to the lost to keep searching for answers, or is it sometimes better to let the past rest? I want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever struggled with a memory you wished you could forget, or one you feared losing forever? Do you believe that some mysteries are better left unsolved, or is the search for truth always worth the cost? Share your reflections and questions in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation alive, for the sake of those who can no longer speak for themselves. In the end, perhaps the only thing more haunting than a mystery unsolved is a story untold. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of Blackgate Asylum, a place where memory and oblivion collide, and where the vanished are never truly gone. If you've made it this far, you're among the few willing to look darkness in the eye and ask the questions others are too afraid to voice. Your curiosity, your empathy, and your willingness to confront the uncomfortable are what keeps stories like this alive. But the story doesn't end here. Blackgate's halls may be empty, but its echoes linger. Some say that on stormy nights, if you stand at the gates and listen closely, you can still hear the faint clatter of dishes, the distant strains of music, and the whispers of those who vanished during the feast. Would you dare return to those ruins, knowing what we now know? Or would you turn away, leaving the past to rot in silence? Let me know in the comments. Would you step inside, or keep your distance? If you found yourself haunted by tonight's tale, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more journeys into the forgotten, the forbidden, and the unexplained. Your thoughts and theories are what make this community thrive, so share your own experiences with haunted places or unsolved mysteries below. Who knows, your story might be the next one we explore together. Next time, we'll descend even deeper into the unknown, unraveling another dark chapter that history tried to erase. Until then, keep your lanterns lit, your minds open, and remember, some feasts never truly end. The shadows of Blackgate are waiting, and the next mystery is always closer than you think.